Well, friends, thank you very much for that very warm welcome. I suppose I'm a sort of strange choice to be doing this sort of thing. I'm not, as some of the previous speakers have been, a musicologist, nor am I really properly, I suppose, a historian of music. Really, what I'm interested in is the sort of society in which music flourishes and how music and society interact over time. And I suppose as you read the evidence from the 16th and 17th centuries, looking for evidence for singing and for the choral tradition, I suppose two things strike you, and I think these two things are very closely related. The first thing that strikes you is apparently how little evidence there is. Some of you may know Chris Marsh's wonderful book on music and society in 17th century England, and you will know the richness of the material which he is drawing on. In Ireland, we have nothing comparable to that sort of material which would allow us to reconstruct how singing and how the choral tradition worked in that world. The second thing that strikes you is that despite the fact there is very little evidence, singing is absolutely everywhere. And I think the interconnection between those two apparently contradictory statements is really quite simple. And that is, singing was so much part of these people's world that they never bothered to write it down. It was such a commonplace. They did it everywhere, in every possible circumstance, and in every possible way. And when you look at some of the very large bodies where they exist of evidence for the world of the 16th and 17th century, sooner or later, you will come across somebody singing, often in a group, sometimes among themselves. To try and illustrate this, I suppose what I did was I took that very large corpus of material, which we call the 1641 depositions. That is, the depositions taken after the rising of 1641, and I looked for references to singing in it. Now, these are documents which are very largely about insurance claims, murders. They're about all sorts of things to do with high politics and aberrant society. And yet, in the middle of this, one John Gregg of Clovenden in Armagh describes how he was attacked and cruelly beaten by a man called Donald. And this man was, and I quote, attacked him, and I quote, in a triumphing and rejoicing manner and with singing. So even while you're murdering someone, singing is something that you can do. To go from one side of the story to another, and to go to Galway, to Waterford, to Longford, and you will find stories there of houses, small houses, not the houses of the great, but small houses where people sheltered in the early months of the rising for protection, for safety, to gather together. And just outside Tuam, just outside Waterford, and in Longford town, there are groups of Protestants sheltering in houses, and what are they doing but singing the psalms repeatedly in large numbers. Not just one psalm, but psalm after psalm after psalm. They sang in groups together to keep their spirits up. And indeed, the singing of psalms became so much characteristic of that world that if you wanted to mock some of those you were attacking, you would sing the psalms in a funny voice, which happens in a number of places. So music, I think, is ubiquitous. Music is everywhere. I could talk about about pipes being played, drums being sounded, bells being rung. Music is everywhere, but singing in particular is ubiquitous. It was so much part of these people's society. It was so much part of this world that they didn't talk about it. And indeed, it is so much part of that society that a great deal of it is simply because singing was exactly that, singing. It was oral. It has disappeared. We know that a great deal of music, and of song in particular, circulated in this world simply by tradition. We know that tunes, for example, were not written down. They were simply known. Those of you who have seen some of the material that survives from the 17th century, and I'm thinking here of something like Bishop Wadding's Small Garland of Pious Songs from the 1670s. That is a number of what we would, I suppose, describe as hymns. Some of them are still performed as the Kilmore carols, or some of them are part of the Kilmore carols. But yet there is no music with any of them. It simply names a tune, which in most cases is no longer identifiable, but to which those words were to be sung. And it was assumed that everyone would know that tune. Now that seems to me to be, in a world of a turbulent world of the 16th and 17th centuries, where populations changed with great regularity, where memory, communal memory, must have been fairly thin, to be able to remember tunes and to pass those tunes on must have been important to the people who did it. Again, we know very little about what they sang. We know, for example, they must have sung ballads. What these ballads were is very unclear. We know that in Scotland, ballad sheets were printed off from the presses and brought to Ulster in barrels, where they were then sold among the people there. Indeed, this is the way in which some ballads may have moved across from Scotland into Ireland. I'm thinking particularly of Hugh Shields' very fine study of the Lass of Aughrim, for example, which probably moved in that way. Now, we know these ballad sheets circulated, almost none have survived. Hugh Shields has pointed out that one has survived, Mount Tara's Triumph, again without music. But these ballad sheets must have been everywhere. But they were quite literally sung to death, as people folded them up, put them in their pockets, took them out, memorized the words and sold them. I mean, this was a world suffused by this. Music, singing is everywhere. And it's about all sorts of things. It's about popular ballads. It's about, as the Presbyterian General Synod in Belfast complained about the lewd ballads being sung in Belfast on the streets at the very beginning of the 18th century. And not just on the streets, but in the pubs. We know, for example, going back to these 1641 depositions, that at Kinnaird in Armagh, just before the rebellion broke out, the men passed the time, hardly surprisingly, drinking and singing until they were ready for the insurrection. So music is part of this world. Music is not something separate. There are no concerts. There are no opera. There is no high art. Music is something which happens every day. People talked about music according to its social setting. There were love songs. There were drinking songs. There were political songs. And these songs came in all shapes and forms, and people called them as such. We have very few of them, but we do have a few from the Irish tradition. That South Ulster poet called Boyle McGillicudna Some of his songs, which we know were written in the late 17th century, still are sung in South Ulster. Whether to the same airs is, of course, very dubious. But, of course, these songs appear in all sorts of forms. I talk about love songs and drinking songs in the pub. But songs in the church could be equally as political and about love and even perhaps about drink. One of the ones, I think, which comes most strongly to my memory is, of course, the anthem written in 1661 for the consecration of the new bench of Irish bishops immediately after the Restoration. It was written, of course, by Dean William Fuller, the newly appointed Dean of St. Patrick's. And Dean Fuller, of course, very well known to at least some of you, a poet of English standing, the man who wrote the words to Purcell's evening hymn. So a guy moving in those circles. The music, of course, is by Richard Hozier. This is one of the very few choral compositions which we can specifically identify as being for Ireland in the 16th and 17th centuries. But it is a political song, at least as much as it is a religious song. Now hath the Lord re-advanced the crown, with thrift of spoil and fanatic zeal pulled down. Well, you want to badmouth your contemporaries, there's how you do it. Now the Lord the mitre hath restored, i.e. the bishops. Bishops are back, lads. Which the crown crown lay in the dust aboard. Praise ye kings, praise ye priests. And then it goes through all sorts of other things that are to be restored. And finally, angels look down, a monarchy. Angels look down and joy to see. Like that above, a hierarchy. The old world is back, lads. Whether you want to call that an anthem, whether you want to call that a political song, it doesn't really matter. The message, I think, is very clear. Now, this means that singing and the choral tradition, as well as the wider world of singing, always had a social context. You were always conveying signs about who you were, what your view of the world was, how the world was to work. So that singing was a profoundly social act. For example, when one sang the Psalms, one almost didn't have to open one's mouth to betray where one stood on a whole range of theological questions. There were styles of singing which identified you as belonging to a particular group. First of all, the fact that you would sing a psalm at all marked you out as a Protestant. Simple. Quite simply because Catholics, after the Reformation, did not sing religious songs in church. They sang religious songs in other places. It's notable, for example, that those songs which do survive from the later 17th century, the Kilmore carols, the Wexford carols, were composed to be sung before Mass or after Mass, but not during Mass. So that these were signs. Singing was a sign of who you were. To sing the Psalms was simply to be a Protestant. To sit down while you were singing the Psalms was a sign of being an English Presbyterian. To stand up was to be a sign of being a Scottish Presbyterian. See? I mean, this is before you open your mouth. The tune to which you sing each psalm, the version of the psalm which you sing, whether you sing a Sternhold and Hopkins version in the 16th century, is a sign that you're a member of the Church of Ireland. Whether you sing in the late 17th century, the Scottish Psalter of 1660 is a sign that you are a rigid Scottish Presbyterian. Psalms were appropriated by congregations. At the very beginning of the 18th century, there is a Psalter printed in Belfast. There's one copy, to the best of my knowledge, in the Lindenhall Library. What is unusual about it is that it has on the title page the arms of Belfast and the words, "This is our Psalter." You think about the Psalms as being universal to Christianity, but particularly universal to Presbyterianism. Here is a small group of Presbyterians saying, these are our Psalms. These are the Psalms which the congregation in Belfast sing. Okay? So singing is an act which marks you out as being a particular group of people. Hence, if you want to mock someone, you sing what they sing, but in a slightly different way. The example, for example, of Mayo, again in the 1640s, one minister called Oliphant talks about the rebels who attacked them singing with deriding voices some of the Psalms. Now, would you take what is part of someone and you alter it very subtly? Again, the example of airs, of the survival of airs, survival of tunes, if you like, through the system is indication of how stable certain communities to whom those tunes were important were, as opposed to the general turnover in population. So if we don't know much about what people sang, and we don't know much about what people sang because so much of it was oral, so they didn't write it down, words were passed from mouth to mouth, we know they must have sung the sort of repertoire which you see in Scotland or in England. But if we don't know much about what they sang, at least we know a great deal about where they sang it. And I want to talk about two places where they sang, to try and give us some sense of what singing and the choral tradition was like in the 17th century. And the first place where people sang was at home, in the household. And they did this at all sorts and in all sorts of different households. In the great households of Ireland, and I think it's worth remembering there are relatively few of those, Ireland in the 16th century was, by European standards, a relatively poor country. However, there were one or two very significant players in the politics of Ireland. One, for example, was the Earl of Kildare, a man who lived in the castle of Maynooth. Now, unfortunately, we know very little about the detail of the castle in Maynooth, because much of what how we can reconstruct what people sang, where they sang it, how many people sang, and so on, in the great houses, is through the household accounts. Now, and Alan Fletcher, some of you will know Alan, but Alan Fletcher's work has been remarkable in drawing together what we can harvest from those household accounts about singing in the great houses. In Maynooth, we know very little about what went on, but this much we do know, that in 1534, the castle was besieged by a force from Dublin when Kildare had gone into rebellion. Those of you who know Maynooth will know there's a small Church of Ireland church at the gate. You will know that the tower of that church looks much older than the main church, and that's because it is. The tower belongs to the Chantry Chapel, which belonged there, and where Kildare kept a college of priests. And as Maynooth Castle was being shelled from the outside, two priests climbed that tower and sang from the top. And they sang, it is described as a motet called Dulcis Amica. What it is, I don't know. Alan doesn't know. There is a Flemish motet, which it could be, but we can't be absolutely sure. But what we do know is the clergy in that college were used to singing outside the straightforward liturgical repertoire of the canon of the Mass. That may well suggest, to me at least, that these were the people who entertained the Earl of Kildare. That the College of Clergy were able to act as household entertainers, household minstrels, and that the castle of Maynooth was a place where you heard singing of that quality. Of more exactness, we can be clear that Dublin Castle was also a place, certainly by the 1570s under Henry Sidney, where singers, a small number of singers, I admit, but a number of singers did entertain the Lord Deputy. Again, what they sang, we don't know. We simply know that in Sidney's accounts, there are accounts for them. And moving into the 17th century, of course, the richest man in Ireland by a long way, and certainly I think the third richest man in the British Isles, Richard Boyle, Earl of Cork, the man who came to Ireland in the 1580s with 5 shillings in his pocket, records in his accounts that he has in his household Jack the singing man. Now, again, what Jack is singing, we don't know, but singing is part of the entertainment in the house. Boyle seems to have kept a consort group of between 4 and 6 players from time to time. And it's clear some of those may have been singers as well. What did they sing? We don't know. Because in the entire Boyle archive, there are no songs. There is no music. There is one song written out on a piece of plain paper, which on a loose sheet, which seems to have been brought from England, which I can't trace in any known printed song from England, which is a deeply anti-Catholic ballad. But this may well be the sort of thing that people entertained each other with by singing after dinner. The great houses, I think, although there are a few of them, certainly had singers who sang. Now, we needn't necessarily restrict ourselves to the great houses, because let's go down a level to a man called Michael Harrison of Lisnagarvey, who was a couple of 100 acres man, not rich by our standards perhaps, but in 1642, when he was attacked by the rebels, he did talk about keeping a man called Thomas Nall, a singer. So even in relatively modest houses, it seems to be in an English tradition, there were people who came together to sing. And it's from that tradition, that sort of house tradition, as the house as centre of sociability. And music is very closely linked with sociability, as I suggested earlier on. It's from that, as sociability moves to other places. In the later 17th century, as the rise of the coffee house, for example, that you get the emergence, as you all heard last week, of the emergence of catch clubs and groups of people coming together to sing glees. Grattan Flood, of course, would tell you that the oldest, that the Hibernian Catch Club, of course, goes back to the 1680s. Well, you can believe that if you like. I rather think it's a bit later than that. But certainly by the end of the 17th century, you are beginning to get centres of sociability who are gathering around singing in a way that people had gathered around the household. As sociability moves out of the household, as you get the rise of the public library, for example, as opposed to the private library at home, the public library of Marshall's, where as you sat at home and drank your tea, now you go to the coffee house. Sociability becomes part of this. As you sat at home and sang, or listened to singers, now you go to the catch club. Of course, catch clubs were places where there was a good deal of rambunctiousness, whatever sort of polite society you may be moving in last week. In the 1680s, for example, Alan Broderick, the family who ultimately became Earls of Middleton in Cork, as a young lawyer is in Dublin, and he writes back that he is bringing catch books from London to Dublin, and he says, if the words be good, and the air pleasing, and the rather to comply with the female fancies, they be pretty bawdy. Blame the women. Standard line. So that, the catch club as a centre of sociability is a place where, bawdiness happens. And the catch club was a place where singing went along with all sorts of other interesting activities. Interestingly, that he should be bringing these glee books and the catches from London, that the interest in the song in London as setting the standards for Ireland is already very marked by the 1680s. And indeed, as time will go on, you will begin to see, by certainly the 1710s, the provincial towns of Ireland, I'm thinking now of places of Belfast, where music in those towns is coming to be taken directly from London, rather than looking to Dublin and in a secondary way. So, music as sociability, singing as sociability, I think is something which is really incredibly important as a place where people get together and people exchange ideas and people reinforce ideas of who they are by what they sing, where they sing, how they sing it. The second venue, if you like, for singing that I want to talk about is, of course, the church. Because these are the two great players in promoting singing in the 17th century. And again, the church, like the great houses and the lesser houses, there are, of course, layers to this. The cathedral tradition is something which clearly was much more dramatic than the parish church. The cathedral tradition, of course, I'm not going to say a great deal about because there's been so much work on that, both by Kerry Houston and by Barry Boyle over the last few years on the two great cathedrals that we know most about in terms of the choral tradition, that is St. Patrick's and Christ Church. That, we know a great deal about those now. We know, for example, as Kerry has pointed out, that most of their repertoire was taken from England. It was fairly standard stuff in St. Patrick's, but well up to the standard of the Chapel Royal, not the sort of second-rate stuff that you might expect to find in an English provincial town. It's a tradition which is well endowed, which has vicar's choral, which has a choir, which is important, I think, because why waste a good choir? At least some of the singing as a centre of sociability is being carried out by the singers from the cathedrals in other places. As early as 1578, for example, Sir John Plunkett is remembering the pre-Reformation world of St. Thomas's Abbey. And he talks about the chanter of St. Patrick's arriving, this is before 1530, arriving with some of the boys into St. Thomas's to entertain the abbot by singing ballads. And again, in the late 17th century, the choirmen of St. Patrick's, as perhaps the choirmen of St. Patrick's still do today, were moonlighting in all sorts of places and were given a very severe rap over the knuckles for singing in the theatre. But the real importance of the church is not in the cathedral tradition, I think. The cathedral tradition is extremely interesting, and a lot has been said, but the real revolution, the singing revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries occurred not in the church, but in the parish, but not in the cathedral, but in the parish church. And it occurred in a very simple way. It occurred because at the Reformation, someone said, why doesn't the congregation sing? As you will remember in the medieval liturgy, as I mentioned earlier on, within the Catholic tradition, singing was something, or at least singing among the congregation was something that happened before or after Mass, not during. During was reserved for the priest, if there was any singing at all. And in Ireland, there's very, very, very little evidence in the 17th century for any musical element within the Catholic Mass. The reason, of course, is very obvious, that most Masses are said in a domestic environment, and a domestic environment cannot produce the sort of resources that you need for orchestral settings, for example, of the Mass, which did happen on one occasion. But that it's this congregational revolution where suddenly it is said, let us sing. And what comes to the fore here, admittedly very slowly and very gradually, are the psalms. No one ever says you will only sing the psalms in church, but very quickly the psalms come to dominate the repertoire, and particularly a collection which first appears in 1562 by Sternhold and Hopkins as a collection of psalms. They add little bits to it up to 1573, and this becomes the standard fare of congregational or mass choral singing throughout the 17th century. What did it sound like? You ask yourself. Well, we have our singers, and our singers are now going to entertain you by showing you what it sounded like. What they're going to do is Psalm 119. Now, the tunes which go with these psalms are added piecemeal to them. The words that you hear in Psalm 119 are Sternhold and Hopkins' words. Okay? The tune is a tune which is added slightly later, but the tunes, as they emerge in the late 16th and 17th century, essentially become known as the common tunes. A number of standard tunes, all of which have the names of English cities. This is, for example, the tune to which you sing while shepherds watch their flocks by night is Winchester, the common Winchester. Okay, so this is what a parish church might have sounded like with Psalm 119.
Blessed are they that perfect are, and pure in mind and heart, whose life and conversations from God's laws never start. Blessed are they that give themselves His statutes to observe. Sing the Lord with all their heart, and never from Him swerve. Oh, to God it might be please my way so to address, that I might both in heart and voice thy laws keep and confess. So should no shame my life attain, whilst I thus set mine eyes, and bend my mind always to muse on thy sacred decrees.
Now, stay there. Now, that's what it sounded like. Yes? Let's hear what it really sounded like. Because what would happen is a number of people, just like you, would wander into a church. Here you all are. First thing that would happen, of course, after the beginnings, when it came to the point of the psalm, you would all stand up. Come on. Right, the church is fairly full. This would not be untypical, perhaps, of a central Dublin church. Now, the next thing is you would look at the words. There is a problem. What is the problem? You can't read. You're illiterate. Put the words down. Come on, put the words down. So how are we going to deal with this problem? Okay. Well, they invented a way of dealing with this problem, which was called lining out. Okay, has anybody ever come across lining out? Lining out simply involved that the parish clerk stood up here, and the parish clerk either knew the words or could read. Okay? The parish clerk would then sing the first line. The congregation would then follow them. The parish clerk would sing the second line. The congregation would follow it. Okay, right the whole way through to the end of the verse. Right? Now we have 4 parish clerks rather than 1. But we are going to have a go. Normally they would give you a little bit of a lead in. It's called the gathering note. We're going to try and do that as well. So let's hear what it might have sounded like. Put the words away. Put the words away. You're illiterate. You can't read. This is how it works. All right? And don't forget the clerk. The clerk will sing the first line, and then you will sing it back to him, and so on. And we'll only do the first verse, you'll be pleased to know. Right.
Blessed are they that perfect are. Blessed are they that perfect are, and pure in mind and heart. and never from him swerve, and never from him swerve.
Give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you. You'll be pleased to know that you did rather better than Precentor Wenton Hall of Christchurch in 1679, writing about the Dublin parish choirs of 1679, where he talked about them being full of ungrateful jars, discords, squeaks, screeches, roarings, etc. You've all become much more attuned to the melodious measure than they had of the 17th century. That's what an English Church of Ireland style congregation would have sounded like around the late 16th or early 17th centuries within Dublin. Now you can see the effect that congregational singing has. I mean, I talked about music as something that drew people together. Well, you've just seen it. And you would see why, if you're under attack, you would sing the psalms. Because it does have that bonding force. Music has that power to pull people together, to identify who you are and what you are. And by doing things in the same way, by lining out, for example, again, you do that even further. You identify who you are. So the psalms become very important. And of course, if you are a godly person, it's even more doubly important because they are scriptural. Now, in the later part of the 17th century, that argument about the Psalms as scriptural comes to have less effect. Part of the reason is that the power of godly Puritanism begins to wane very dramatically. So that the way in which people begin to think about what they can sing in church, how they can sing it in church, begins to change. You get a very significant move, I think, in England, where you begin to get, in 1679, John Patrick produces his century of select psalms. Now, these for the first time are not metrical psalms. I mean, he's moving away from that metrical tradition. And then, finally, by the late 17th century, you're getting the emergence of things which are not necessarily metrical, things that we would describe as hymns. They're not psalms, they're actually composed. They're actually someone sits down and puts it together. They're not taken straight from Scripture. And they are not necessarily metrical either. The rise of the hymn. Part of it, as I say, is to do with this decline in the godly insistence of these things being scriptural. But nevertheless, Scripture is the one of the things which affects the way these are written. Now, one of the very earliest hymn books in the British Isles, in fact, is an Irish hymn book. In fact, there are two hymn books by the same man, a man called Joseph Boyce. And he writes two hymn books for Ireland. One's called Sacramental Hymns, appears in 1693. And the second is called Family Hymns, which appears in 1701. Joseph Boyce is an English Presbyterian minister. He's minister of Wood Street. I'm trying to think where Wood Street is from here. It's just opposite St. Patrick's, really. It's beside the cathedral. He's minister of Wood Street. He's from an English Presbyterian tradition. Now, the point about the English Presbyterian tradition is that the Scottish Presbyterian tradition comes out of a world whereby they regard themselves as the established church, which they were in Scotland after 1690. The English Presbyterian tradition is a tradition of voluntarism, where you actually have an option to join the church. So therefore, it's much more of a gathered community. So therefore, the bonding forces, the sort of bonding forces that singing can provide, are much more important. So that Boyce wants to produce, if you like, a powerful message, which is not necessarily based on the Psalms, as in Ulster, but is something which will draw people together. So what he does is he searches the Scriptures, and he draws together verses from different parts of the Scriptures. This is a standard interpretive technique, and they draw together these things to create these things called hymns. Now, can we have our singers again? And almost all of Boyce's hymns are to one tune, right? It is the tune, you will see it there on your sheet. It's called "To the Tune of the 100th Psalm." That is the thing we now call "All People that on Earth do dwell," Old 100th. Okay? And Boyce, the first of Boyce's sacramental hymns is this one here. You can see he tells you where it's coming from. 1 Peter, first chapter, verses 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Okay? And he welds this sacramental hymn out of those verses. Okay? And this is sung during the celebration of the sacrament. Okay? Presbyterians had a tradition of having a very large sacramental tradition, a very strong sacramental tradition early on, which they later lose. But there's a very strong tradition, and a strong tradition of people sitting around the tables singing hymns as they are eating the bread and the wine. And this is the sort of thing that Boyce wanted you to sing to draw you together into one group. Take it away, lads.
Blessed be the Father of our Lord, forever blessed be God on high, whose glorious works of grace express His rich and great benignity.
I know it's 2 o'clock and some of you may have to go, but do you want to have a go? Yeah. Okay. How you must think of this is you're in the right position. You're not going to stand. You're sitting around the communion table. All right? Women should have their heads covered. Heads covered. Very good. You're sitting around the communion table. Wine is being passed from person to person and bread is being passed. The minister will not serve you. Because everyone is equal here, wine is passing around, the bread is passing around, and as the meal is passing around, you are all singing. Blessed be the Father of our Lord, forever blessed be God on high, whose glorious works of grace express His rich and great benignity. Thank you. Those people who cannot understand why religion is such a powerful force in 17th century Ireland should now understand why. I mean, the power of that sort of singing to draw people together into a community and to convey a message, sometimes a very complicated theological message, in a relatively simple way. This is the singing revolution. This is what makes the world the way it will be for the next 200 years. Thank you very much.